introducing myself and just letting y'all know I don't have a PowerPoint and I'll be dealing with international relations theory. So please try to focus. I know it's a little bit dry, but I think if you listen, you'll find it's actually pretty interesting. So like I've said, my name is Blake Center, and I'm presenting on the Marshall Plan as analyzed with national values theory and defensive realism. So more specifically, I want to present my argument that focuses on the origins and the intentions of the Marshall Plan's marriage between asserting ideological ascendancy as well as enhancing security. So first, it's important that I define the working theories. So national values theory, as you can imagine, describes a state's foreign policy as seeking to further its national values. But if you're familiar with idealism, or Wilsonian idealism, it's important that we differentiate these two. Now, national values theory is unlike idealism in the sense that it's not necessarily inspired by a sense of exceptionalism, nor is it necessarily concerned with moral or ethical concerns. And now, defensive realism states that the anarchical structure, which basically means a free-for-all structure, of the international system encourages states to maintain moderate and reserved foreign policy to attain security. Now, this is in opposition to offensive realism, which states that states will try to dominate each other via violent or aggressive means. So defensive realism is different in that it will seek to enhance security by means of peacetime alliances, geopolitics, economic diplomacy, etc. So now that we've got the theory behind us, let me get into something that's a little more interesting and provide you with a snapshot of the Marshall Plan. So I assure you it's more than the care packages that you learned about, in high school history where you see the airdrops to Berlin. It was actually $13 billion of US aid to Western Europe. And today that's upwards of $150 billion, so a significant sum. But it's far more than just economic aid. So reading from the paper, the stage had been set on the post-World War II landscape. The last men standing, the United States and the Soviet Union, would quarrel for dominance within the anarchic system. Amidst growing tensions between the two regional hegemons, the United States opportunistically seized leadership of the post-war West by promoting its own ideology and containing that of the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan represents a series of preemptive measures and long-term investments by which the U.S. gained leverage materially and ideologically in the fight to dominate the anarchic system and instate a favorable balance of power. Now, another point of context that's important to note is that via the Truman Doctrine's aid to Greece and Turkey, which were economically vulnerable to Soviet communist expanse, the U.S. had just accepted the baton, if you will, of Western leadership from Great Britain. So that is important to note. And true to that new Western role, or rather the new role as a Western leader, the U.S. sought to influence this disturbed balance of power. That is the power vacuum of Europe. And as I noted, $13 billion in aid. Now the intentions of this aid, what the Marshall Plan sought to do, was to rebuild the war-torn infrastructure of Western Europe. As you can imagine, since you all are relatively familiar with post-war period, Western Europe was destroyed. Many of the roads and bridges were destroyed, their infrastructure, for example, water transportation systems were largely inoperable, and thousands were left homeless. Further, the U.S. wanted to rehabilitate the economies using American economic values, which is important to note because the basis for this rehabilitation is not just economic diplomacy, but they wanted to structure and integrate a sort of Western market and place the U.S. at the top of said market, all the while basing this market on capitalist free market principles. And this market would be self-reinforcing and mutually beneficial. And all of this would be done under the thin veil of altruism to promote United States national values in order to adopt countries into their sphere of influence and contain the expanse of Soviet communism via the building of a geopolitical wall manifesting itself in the trade network. So under the guidance of a system of new US-led global organizations, the US would solidify its role as leader of the new Western order. So let me jump into the first pillar of of this national values imposition. The first is economic diplomacy. Like I said, the primary vehicle for US national values within the Marshall Plan. And Truman's logic, or President Truman's logic, was that economically stable countries would be far less susceptible to communist expansion. They'd be less willing to experiment with sort of this exotic ideology. So the logic was that we not only assert ideological supremacy and ascendancy via our national values, but we would help rebuild these markets and make them self-sufficient, but also self-reliant in the sense that they can function on their own, but in the sense that their currency is rehabilitated, but the trade market is interdependent. Let's see. So this essentially creates a trade alliance that's going to foster transnational relations. And what's very important to note is that, especially with West Germany's inclusion in the trade market, it extends a global invitation that all countries are welcome in said trade market, as long as they play by the ideological rules of the game, that is, free market capitalism. So in this way, like I said, Truman's logic is that if Europe is doing well, then the US will do well. So this is sort of an admission. Scholars like David Lake assert this, that a country's wealth is its primary sense of security. So we can see within a defense-dominant conflict an obvious enhancement of latent power. That is, maybe a country's wealth, ideological ascendancy. These are not necessarily like a stockpiling of military armaments like you'd seen in the Cold War, but more so a complementary stockpiling of not only wealth, but ideological influence and ideologically aligned allies. And another thing that's important to note is George Kennan. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with him. Former ambassador to the Soviet Union. He was the biggest proponent of a sort of containment policy. That the best way to fight the Soviet Union, although he didn't think that they were capable of winning a war with the US, especially in a conflict of nuclear deterrence, it was favorable to commit money, not blood, if that makes sense. That rather than pursue offensively realist or violent, aggressive means, we would pursue means based in economic diplomacy and containment. And he extols the virtues of containment and soft power in his long telegram and X article. Now, within the X article, he notes that the Soviet leader's biggest insecurity is the inferiority of communist dictatorship. So within that is their fear of encountering a stable and economically vigorous West. And in that, to be exposed as inferior. So with this economic order, under US values, the US is going to earn an assemblage of faithful and ideologically congruent allies that, as I said, creates a geopolitical wall against this iron curtain, and stands in opposition to Soviet expansion. The ideological presence would not only intimidate the Soviet Union, but severely reduce its actual capabilities of expansion. For if the USSR expanded into a Marshall Plan-aided country, it would surely provoke not only a US response, but a new Western order response and incite conventional war. So while I'd like to go over the legacy of the Marshall Plan, I don't think I'm going to have time, but you can see the legacy in theories like liberal internationalism that would extol the virtues of global organizations like the UN, the World Bank, alliances like NATO, which, in my opinion, were sparked by the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. But as I've sought to explain the origins and intentions, I think that national values theory and defensive realism are best. So to end, I'd like to reiterate that as a defense-dominant conflict, the Cold War encouraged the use of economic diplomacy and the weaponized use of ideology to enhance security. And we can interpret this ideological arms race as a complement to the stockpiling of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons. Also, I'd like to reiterate the logical application of the Marshall Plan. economically stable countries would be less vulnerable to communist takeover. 4, U.S. values effectiveness would entice other countries to join the Western order. And further, given the engendered loyalty of these aided countries and ideologically congruent allies, the Soviet Union faces a far more formidable threat in a unified West rather than just the U.S. acting unilaterally. So it would enjoy enhanced security not only with its ideologically consistent allies and favorable balance of power, but it would also reap the benefits of a new and flourishing trade market, all the while containing the Soviet Union. So even though the Marshall Plan's economic aid and spreading of national values were beneficial for all participating states, I argue that it was a matter of self-interest, in the realist interest of enhancing state security. So as such, the Marshall Plan is best understood, as a self-help measure inspired by the anarchic system's disturbed balance of power, and it served as an investment in U.S. hegemony. And in this way, the Marshall Plan represents the U.S. use of weaponizing its national values to fulfill the self-interested goal of enhancing its security in a defense-dominant conflict. And in this way, national values theory and defensive realism best explain the Marshall Plan. So thank you all for listening. I know it's a little dry with the theory, but I appreciate your time. So I'm happy to also answer any questions that you might have, or perhaps be challenged on anything I've said. I'm open to anything. So
thank you, Blake.
Sure.
I think in terms of organization, I think we'll actually work our way through all the presentations first of all, and then we'll have some time for questions. So if you're anything like me, you've been writing down some questions as you've been hearing Blake's presentation, and so then once we get through all three, we could field questions.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Sure thing.